The desert wind blew hard across the plains, lifting swirls of dust that caught the dying sun and turned the air into a copper haze. It was the kind of wind that carried whispers of wagon wheels long gone, of cattle drives that had thundered by decades before, of men buried shallow in the ground after gunfights no one remembered anymore. Out here, 20 miles beyond the nearest town, there stood a lonely house on the edge of Bitter Creek. Its boards were gray with age, its roof patched more times than a gambler's coat, its windows streaked with grit and silence. And inside that house lived a woman the folks in town called simply the widow. Her name was Clara Boone. She had once been Clara McGraw, daughter of a Missouri blacksmith, and then Clara Boone, wife of Thomas Boone, a farmer turned cattleman who had brought her west with dreams of land and children. But the land had been cruel, the cattle thin, and the children never came. Thomas had been killed 20 years back, shot in the chest in a dispute over water rights during one of those endless, dusty summers when men's tempers dried up like the earth itself. Since that day, Clara had been alone, 40 when she buried him, now nearing 60, her body wary as mesquite, her hair silver, her eyes sharp as the desert hawk's. She had no kin, no children, no reason to ride into town except for supplies twice a year. Most people in Dry Creek forgot she was still alive. But that night, as the sun sank and the first coyotes began their hungry singing, Clara Boone's solitude came to an end. She was on her porch, rocking slow in a chair built by Thomas himself all those years ago. Her rifle leaned against the wall as it always was, when she heard them. Voices. Children's voices. At first she thought the wind was playing tricks on her, carrying echoes from some distant camp. But then came the crunch of feet on the hard pan road, many feet, stumbling, dragging. She stood, her hand tightening on the rifle. No one came this way unless they had business, or trouble. Out of the dusk they emerged, a ragged line of children, 15 in all, from a boy barely walking to a lanky youth of maybe 16. Their clothes were torn, their faces blackened with dust, their eyes hollow with hunger and fear. They moved like cattle driven too far, close together, leaning on one another. And at their front was a girl, tall for her age, her jaws set with the kind of steel you don't often see in the young. She stopped at the gate, lifted her chin, and spoke with a voice that trembled but did not break. "Mom," she said, "we don't got nowhere else to go. Will you take us in?" Clara stared at them, stunned. For 20 years she had lived without a soul to speak to, without laughter or tears not her own. Now here were 15 of them, staring at her like she was some kind of savior. Her first instinct was to turn them away. What could she do with so many mouths? She was an old woman with nothing but a few goats, a garden patch, and a house full of silence. But something in the girl's eyes held her still. There was fire there, the same fire she remembered in her own reflection long ago, when she and Thomas first came west, full of hope. And she could not ignore the way the youngest clung to the older ones, the way their ribs showed through shirts too thin for the desert nights. "What happened to you?" Clara asked, her voice rough from Dessous. The girl swallowed hard. "Stagecoach. Outlaws hit it, killed the drivers, we ran." Her lips trembled now. "We been walking 2 days." Lara felt a chill crawl her spine. Outlaws. The territory crawled with them. Renegades, drifters, men too mean for towns. If they had attacked a stage, then these children had seen hell already. She looked at them again, saw the blood crusted on one boy's sleeve, the way another limped badly. And against all reason, against the hard shell she had built around her heart for 2 long decades, something inside her cracked. "Come inside," she said. They filled the house with noise, those children. Within minutes the rooms echoed with voices, whispers, coughing, even laughter. Sounds the old boards hadn't carried in years. Clara moved among them like a ghost at first, her hands unsure. She ladled what stew she had into every bowl she could find, watched them devour it with a hunger that made her throat ache. She boiled water, tore up old sheets for bandages, cleaned wounds with a tenderness that surprised her own hands. The girl who had spoken at the gate helped her, steady and serious. Her name was Martha. She said the younger ones were orphans from St. Agnes' home back in Dodge, sent west on the stage to be placed with families. But bandits had waylaid them in the canyon, and the guardians had been shot before their eyes. Martha had led them out, away from the killing, through 2 days of dust and fear until Bitter Creek appeared before them. Clara listened in silence. She had no words for such loss. But as Martha spoke, she felt her own heart stirring with something she had not felt in years. Purpose. That night, Clara could not sleep. The children lay on blankets spread across the floor, some curled like puppies, others restless with dreams of gunfire. The house smelled of stew and sweat and life, and the sound of their breathing filled the darkness. Clara sat by the window, rifle across her knees, staring at the moonlit desert. Outlaws had killed those guardians. If they knew children had escaped, they might come looking. And if they did, they would find more than they bargained for. Clara Boone might be old, but she was not weak. She had defended this house alone for 20 years. She would defend it now for these children. And in her chest, under the weight of age and sorrow, something small and fierce began to burn. For the first time since Thomas's death, she was not alone. For the first time in 20 years, her house had a family. By morning, she knew the decision was made. The children would stay. But decisions in the West carried consequences, and before long, Clara Boone would learn just how far the desert, the town, and the outlaws were willing to push back against an old widow who dared to open her door. The real fight had only begun. The sun had not yet risen when Clara Boone heard the dogs bark. Bitter Creek's mornings were usually quiet. Just the rustle of wind through dry grass, the caw of crows, the creak of old boards settling. But this morning the sound was sharp, urgent, the kind that made the hair rise on the back of her neck. She slid out of bed, her rifle in hand before her bare feet touched the floor. The children stirred on their blankets. Martha sat up, rubbing her eyes. "What is it, Miss Boone?" The Clara hushed her with a finger and moved to the window. Out on the ridge, silhouetted by the pale gray dawn, 3 riders sat their horses, watching the house. She knew the kind, slouched in their saddles, rifles laid easy across their arms, hats pulled low. Outlaws. The same that had cut down the guardians on the stage, no doubt. They'd followed the tracks of 15 children straight to her door. Her first thought was to fight. 20 years alone had sharpened her into something hard as iron. But then she felt the floor creak beneath her, the weight of small lives depending on her courage, and she knew this was no longer her fight alone. "Martha," she said quietly, "wake the older ones. Keep the young'uns low. Do as I say and no more." "Yes, Mom," Martha whispered, her face pale but steady. Clara stepped out onto the porch, rifle leveled, her breath forming little clouds in the cold air. The riders trotted closer, their horses snorting, hooves crunching on the hard earth. When they were 20 yards off, the one in front drew up his reins. He was tall, his coat black and dusty, his beard thick and wary, a scar cut through his cheek like a lightning bolt. "Morning, widow," he called. His voice was smooth, practiced, like a man who enjoyed hearing himself. "Name's Jeb Crow. You've got something belongs to us." Clara didn't flinch. "You mean the children? 15 little strays." He grinned, showing yellow teeth. "Worth a pretty penny down south. Folks pay good for workers. Or worse." Her stomach twisted, but she kept her face steel. "They're under my roof. You best ride on." The men laughed, all 3. Crow leaned forward in his saddle. "Now, widow, I don't aim to make trouble for an old gal. But you hand over the brats, we'll leave you be. Otherwise." His hand hovered near his revolver. "We'll come take For a long moment, the desert held its breath. The sun crept over the ridge, turning the riders' shadows long and dark. Clara Boone, who had once buried her husband with her own hands, who had spent 20 years staring down the silence of an empty home, made her choice. She raised the rifle. The crack split the dawn. Crow's hat flew from his head, the bullet carving clean through its crown. His horse reared, nearly throwing him. The other men cursed, jerking their rifles up. But Clara's voice rang out sharp and steady. "The next one goes through your skull." Crow steadied his horse, his grin gone. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then he spat in the dirt. "You've made a mistake, widow. We'll be back, with more men." He wheeled his horse, the others following, and the 3 rode off into the desert, dust rising behind them like smoke. Clara lowered her rifle, her hands trembling only once they were gone. She turned back to the doorway. 15 wide eyes stared at her from the shadows. Some were frightened, some awed. Martha stood tall among them, her chin lifted, her jaw tight with pride. "You're safe," Clara said, her voice hoarse. For now, the town word traveled faster than the desert wind. By noon, every saloon, goer and shopkeeper in Dry Creek knew that Clara Boone had taken in 15 orphans and stared down Jeb Crow himself. Some laughed, an old widow against outlaws. She'd be dead within the week. Others shook their heads, muttering that Crow's gang had grown bold, that even the sheriff would be wise to steer clear. Sheriff Ben Holt heard it in the barber shop. He was a wary man, past 50, his badge tarnished from years of holding peace in a town that didn't want much of it. He saddled up, rode out to Bitter Creek, and found Clara at her well, drawing water with Martha at her side. "Clara Boone," he said, dismounting. "Heard tell you've got yourself a houseful." The Clara gave him a hard look. "Their children, Ben. Not strays to be left for wolves." Holt rubbed his jaw. "You've stirred up Crow. He and his boys won't forget being shown up. Then let him come." She set her bucket down with a thud. "I've been alone 20 years. Now I've got reason to fight." The sheriff studied her, then the girl beside her who met his gaze without blinking. Finally he sighed. "I'll do what I can. But Dry Creek's thin on law. You'd best be ready." Will," Clara said. Teaching survival days turned into weeks. The children settled into life at Bitter Creek, but it was no easy thing. Food was scarce. Beds had to be built. Wounds healed slowly, nightmares slower still. Clara drove them hard, for she knew softness could kill quicker than hunger. She taught the boys to mend fence, to tend goats, to watch the horizon for riders. She taught the girls to draw water, to cook with little, to shoot straight. Even the youngest learned chores, gathering eggs, picking beans, sweeping floors. At night around the fire, she told them stories of Thomas, of the early days when the West was wild and hope was high. And though her body ached, though she lay awake with worry most nights, Clara felt a strange new strength in her bones. These children were hers now, as surely as if they'd been born of her womb. For 20 years she had believed herself barren. But here they were, 15 of them, filling her home with life. The return of Crow had happened on a Sunday afternoon. The sky was red with dust, the air thick and still. Clara was in the garden when she heard the thunder of hooves. The children rushed to the windows as riders appeared on the ridge. 10, maybe 12. At their head rode Jeb Crow, his scar catching the sun. He reined in, called out across the yard. "Widow Boone, you had your chance. Hand 'em over now, and maybe we'll let you breathe another day." The Clara stood in the doorway, rifle in hand, Martha beside her holding Thomas's old revolver. Behind them, the children crouched, weapons clutched in small fists, axes, knives, even sharpened sticks. "You'll have to kill me first," Clara called. Crow grinned. "That can be arranged." He raised his arm. The outlaws spurred forward, guns flashing. The sound of gunfire tore through Bitter Creek, echoing off the canyon walls. Clara fired from the porch, dropping one rider clean out of the saddle. Martha fired next, her shot wild but close enough to send another horse skittering. The boys on the roof hurled rocks. The younger ones screamed, prayed, clung to one another. The battle was chaos, dust and smoke and blood. Clara moved like a woman half her age, steady as stone. She remembered every trick Thomas had taught her, every lesson learned in 20 years of solitude. One by one the outlaws fell, until the survivors wheeled their horses and fled, dragging their wounded with them. When the smoke cleared, the yard was littered with bodies. 2 of the children were hurt, one badly, but alive. Clara stood in the doorway, her rifle empty, her breath ragged, her face streaked with sweat and tears. She looked at the children, 15 pairs of eyes that now saw her not just as a widow, not just as a woman who had taken them in, but as something more. As mother, as protector, as leader. And though her arms trembled, though her heart ached with the weight of what was to come, Clara Boone knew one truth: Bitter Creek was no longer a place of silence. It was a fortress. And she would hold it, for them, until her last breath. The sun set that night, blood red over the desert, painting the land with fire. In town, men whispered of the battle, of how the widow Boone had stood against Jeb Crow's gang and lived. Some said she was mad, others said she was blessed. But the children in her house knew the truth. She had been barren in body, but not in spirit. And now, against all odds, she had 15 children who called her theirs. The fight for survival was far from over. The Wild West held more dangers than outlaws: hunger, drought, betrayal. But as the coyotes howled and the stars wheeled overhead, Clara Boone sat on her porch, rifle across her knees, Martha beside her, and listened to the sound of children sleeping safe inside her home. For the first time in 20 years, she felt alive. And for the first time ever, she felt whole.